Hey everyone, just doing another video philosophy of Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda, and I wanted to talk about a lot of different topics, including a comparative analysis of both of those pieces, as well as an overarching analysis of what science fiction is trying to tell us about the future, because science fiction often is a way of telling people things about the world and about themselves that they wouldn't be able to do so in a politically correct or kind manner to most people, because you're basically analyzing or setting up hypothetical scenarios in science fiction for both utopian and dystopian futures for humanity, and it's a way of telling people things about themselves and about the world that they may not be able to accept if you just give it to them right away. But if you do it in a more creative way, and if you do it in a more like, I don't want to say subversive, just in a more like cloaked with different meanings and with different art, then you can kind of give them the substance without giving them the direct message. So I really appreciate Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek in so many ways, because especially Star Trek to be in particular, because it really helped me grow as a person and I was younger, and it really taught me good values as a young kid. So I want to start out at the beginning comparing two very interesting groups that Gene Roddenberry wrote about. So the first would be the Advanced Humans, run by Khan, Noonien Sung, who everyone knows Khan, the Wrath of Khan, the most how do I say this, popular character in Star Trek, basically, for villains anyways, that everyone knows the Wrath of Khan and the iconic, Kirk yelling into the communicator and at him, and basically he basically represents augmented humans and eugenics, because in this timeline of humanity, basically a whole bunch of genetically enhanced humans start running the world pre-Kirk and the Enterprise and Federation and everything. So that's a really interesting topic. And then I want to move on and then compare those augmented humans to the augmented humans, the Nietzscheans, who exist in Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda show, because Andromeda also has its own version of augmented humans that are genetically superior to the original human species, which were invented, not evolved naturally, and they also have very similar ways of approaching things. So I think that, I don't know if anyone's ever made this connection between the fact that there are, Khan-type augmented humans running around in the Star Trek universe, and then you also have Nietzscheans like Tyr Anasazi or Telemachus Rhade in Andromeda, and it really does add an aspect to the show that I don't think is common in Star Wars, because Star Wars has augmented humans, but they're different. They're more cyborgs, or they are aliens, or they are basically Jedi, so they're not necessarily those pure humans that have been manipulated with gene science. So genetics and genetic augmentation and eugenics has been a topic that Gene Roddenberry has covered significantly in both of his pieces, and this goes from a philosophical level as well, because he really invited a lot of philosophers onto his panels, and for his advisory, in an advisory capacity and in a writing capacity, for the production of Star Trek and for Andromeda. And you can see it really clearly, and I'll make it very clear for everyone here as well when I give the examples. But as you can see clearly, in comparison to a lot of other, which there are other, science fiction shows and books that deal with the topic of eugenics and gene augmentation, but it's something that is very common and very front and center in Star Trek versus the other worlds. So I want to analyze what exactly that says and what exactly Gene Roddenberry is trying to tell us about the world that we live in, or the future that we're going to live in as well. So I want to start off with Star Trek because it's a lot more common and people know about it, and Andromeda is a lot less, but I think that it's important to draw a connection between the two, because Andromeda really was the afterthought after Star Trek, but he still continued on with this eugenics, normal humans versus genetically superior augmented humans, and they have these conflicts, and they're really central to some of the original Star Trek not the Next Generation, even though he does come back in some of these. Khan doesn't feature very prominently in most of the series, but he still remains one of the most iconic villains of all of the series. So I want to begin with Khan Noonien Sung, who, interestingly enough, also is part of the Star Trek lore as well. Khan Noonien Sung is also the guy who ends up being the really old guy from Star Trek TNG the next generation, who constructs data, the android, and lore. So he is a really important character in a lot of different ways. And even though he doesn't stay on as a villain, he kind of changes and becomes someone else by the end. He is definitely an important, prominent figure because, as you can see, he not only was involved in, starting a revolt of augmented humans against normal humans, but also he engaged in the construction of artificial intelligence data, who basically is a living being because he's so advanced. So I don't know, he's a really important character. So let's begin. And this is from Memory Alpha Wiki on Khan, Noonien, and Sung. Khan, Noonien, and Sung is the most dangerous adversary the Enterprise ever faced. He is brilliant, ruthless, and will not hesitate to kill every single one of you. And this is from Star Trek Into Darkness quote from Spock. Khan, Noonien, and Sung, or simply Khan, was an extremely intelligent and dangerous superhuman who was the most prominent of the genetically engineered human augments of the late 20th century eugenics wars period on Earth, which takes place in the fictional Earth in Star Trek. Khan was considered by the USS Enterprise command crew over the was discovered over 3 centuries later to have been the best of them. He reappeared with a cadre of augment followers in the 23rd century, and Khan became a notorious enemy of James T. Kirk. Khan's existence as an augment served as well as a warning to the society of the dangers in attempting to create superhumans through technological means. Ambassador Spock stated that he was the most dangerous adversary the Enterprise ever faced. So, a lot of interesting stuff there, and it actually flows directly into what I was saying about the fact that Gene Roddenberry was definitely trying to warn the future and warn us about genetically altered humans. And just as a side point, I don't really think it's been as publicly stated, and there haven't been very many people coming out and saying, I am an augment, but I assume that there's nothing we can do, because I've studied this both at school and in biomedical ethics at university, but also I worked at an infertility clinic that deals with PGD, which is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, a procedure used prior to implantation to help identify genetic defects within embryos. This serves to prevent certain genetic diseases or disorders from being passed on to the children. So I've already been part of a company that was engaging in these practices, but not for the sake of eugenics. They're doing it in order to weed out any people that or any potential embryos that have health problems that would decrease the quality of life, basically. Yeah, thank you. The quality of life, basically, for the people that would be born with these things. So it's not that we don't want them to be born. We just want them to be born healthier and happier and have a better quality of life. So I think that going on, yeah, it clearly does illustrate what I said, the fact that even the characters in Star Trek are saying, yes, this is an example of why it becomes illegal to augment humans. And then I'll go further and say, in Star Trek Deep Space Nine with Dr. Bashir, he is an augment and he's a super genius, but he has to hide it because it's illegal, and all the people that do get augmented and become super geniuses in episodes in DS9 when they're facing the Dominion, and they hire all of these people to basically run simulations and run ways to figure out logistics and strategies to defeat the Dominion. But the reality is that these people are looked down upon in the Star Trek universe because they are augmented, and the normal humans made it illegal to do this because there was a giant war. So I'm going to go into the origins of this 20th century origins of Khan and of this conflict in the Star Trek universe. Records of this period, including Khan's origins, are fragmentary and therefore vague. He is a product of selective breeding and genetic engineering scientific program based on the eugenics philosophy that held improving the capabilities of man would improve the entire human race. Augments produced by the program possessed physical strength and analytic capabilities considerably superior to ordinary humans, and were engineered from a variety of Earth's ethnic groups. Khan's background was suspected to be Sikh from the northern region of India. Khan lived up to the axiom coined by one of his creators: superior ability breeds superior ambition. By 1993, in the fictional universe, a wave of genetic superhumans, including Khan, had simultaneously assumed control of more than 40% of Earth's nations. From 1992 to 1996, Khan was the absolute ruler of more than 1/4 of the Earth's population, including the regions of Asia and the Middle East, considered the best of tyrants. He severely curtailed the freedoms of his subjects, but his reign was an exception to similar circumstances in Earth's history, lacking internal massacres of war and aggression. So, for example, in this situation, it seems like he is one of those people, and he's been used in this capacity, and he basically takes over because of his superior abilities. So that, and that's then involves strength as well. They didn't also, well, yeah, they did ask physical strength at the beginning. So he's superhuman in almost every capacity. In the mid-1990s, the augmented tyrants began warring amongst themselves. Other nations combined their efforts to force them from power in a series of struggles that became known as the Eugenics Wars. Eventually, most of the tyrants were defeated and their territory recaptured, but as many as 90 supermen were never accounted for. And this includes Khan, and that's why he shows up 300 years later on a ship called the Botany Bay, and he's in suspended animation, and then Kirk and them release him unknowingly, and then that starts off all of this stuff. And it's also the subject of Star Trek Into Darkness, the terrible J.J. Abrams movie. Okay, reboot movie. Okay, so now that we've got all this context, we really understand the basis for this stuff. I just want to go and say that this is a really common thread that runs through almost all of J.J. Abrams' Star Trek content, where the augmented humans, they lead into data, so they have something to do with the androids and the AI, but it also leads into the augmented humans. So it has a lot of questions and a lot of philosophy involved in this idea because, like he said, eugenics was a philosophy, and it was in 1883, Sir Francis Galton, a respected British scholar and cousin of Charles Darwin, first used the term eugenics, meaning well-born. Galton believed that the human race could help direct its future by selectively breeding individuals who have, quote-unquote, desired traits. So basically, he wanted to treat humans like animals, in a sense, in the breeding capacity, that they wanted to selectively breed characteristics that supposedly people wanted, desirable characteristics, and weed out the characteristics that are not. So nowadays, you look at a program like the one I was involved in, and you can see that these people are doing this now, but they're doing it with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, instead of just looking at a person and analyzing them and saying, well, some of these characteristics we want, we'll keep those, some of them we don't want, we won't keep those. This, we're doing it on a genetic level. So after cracking the genome, basically we are at a level where we're scientifically picking which exact genetics we want to include and which ones we don't. So it's gone beyond the animal rearing, animal husbandry kind of stuff on a human level, and it's now gone into the science and philosophy realm a lot more. So in terms of whether this stuff is happening in real life, yes, it is happening in real life, and everyone should realize that these warnings were there for a reason, and these were very scary, very real warnings for people. So now we get to the connection between Andromeda Ascendants and Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. And this is the good Andromeda, not Mass Effect, just to put it out there. It really makes it difficult for me to search Andromeda Ascendant and search Andromeda, Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda content, because there's so much terrible screenshots and hilarious memes of Mass Effect Andromeda that it really just ruins it, because I have to scroll through so many pages of crap before I get to anything I actually want. So, just to overview the Nietzscheans. The Nietzscheans, funnily enough, Nietzsche obviously comes from the philosopher, so they're basically using the philosophy of Nietzsche, but they also bring in Ayn Rand too, and I'll explain it as well. So clearly, Gene Roddenberry had a very philosophical mind, or at least his writers and the people he chose to include in it did, because they literally named an entire species of genetically superior augmented humans Nietzscheans. So it's very weird. Okay, so anyway, so that's a really huge connection right there, and I don't know if I've never even seen anyone make this connection before, so I'm breaking new ground, hopefully, philosophically and in terms of where the future is going. The Nietzscheans are a subspecies of genetically engineered humans who religiously follow the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, social Darwinism, and Dawkins' genetic competitiveness. So talking about Richard Dawkins. They claim to be physically perfect and distinguished by bone blades protruding out from their wrist area of their and a little bit down their arm. So there'd be 3 protruding blade coming out of their arm that way. Okay. The race's trinomial taxonomic name is Homo sapiens invictus, which means unconquerable wise man in the ancient Earth language Latin. Although Nietzsche frequently wrote about the Übermensch, Nietzscheans themselves in the fictional story take offense to the use of the word Uber, which is used as a derogatory term to describe them. The term is usually used by humans. So the origin. So this is what I want to get into, because it's so interesting, the fact that these people are exactly the same, like the Nietzscheans and the augmented Khan people from the Star Trek universe. Essentially, they're both from Gene Roddenberry's mind, but they both have the same characteristics. They're genetically augmented humans They're superior to us, and it's a warning. It's a huge warning to everyone, so I'm just putting it out there. This is a warning. Genetics could lead us into war and conflict with these superior humans at some point. And whether we win or not, that's, we don't even know, because, and this is the point that I was going to get to, but I'll remove it after. I'll get to the context, and then I'll say what I think about it. So this is where the philosophy part comes in. It's very interesting. So the Nietzschean subspecies originated at Ayn Rand Station. Ayn Rand Station, like Ayn Rand, the philosopher. The planet that he was on, the planet that he named it was also called Fountainhead, that Drago Museveni was on as well. So it's like, Fountainhead was one of the two books that Ayn Rand wrote that made her famous in the philosophy world and in the mainstream world, one of which was called Atlas Shrugged, which I really loved, and I read that and I thought it was great. Not the best. I mean, some of it's obviously bullshit in terms of her ideas and objectivism, but I actually felt like it was really great to add that to ideas so that I could have something to build upon instead of just, avoiding it and saying, oh, it's terrible, I should never read that, no one should ever read that. Actually, it's one of the greatest reads that I ever had, and it's fiction. So it's just a way of distributing her philosophy in a way that, isn't dry and academic. But moving on. The Nietzschean subspecies originated at Ayn Rand Station in CY 8400 by Dr. Paul Museveni, a human geneticist left Earth and headed out to deep space with about 3,000 followers. Dr. Museveni's views were not considered proper and thus were shut out of the mainstream scientific community. 4 months later, Museveni's fleet arrived at the Omri Globular Cluster just outside the Milky Way galaxy. A habitable world was found orbiting the Beta Sirius Omega star. Museveni and his followers named this planet Fountainhead. So yeah, once again, you can see how Fountainhead was the one before Atlas Shrugged. So it's interesting that the origin of their genetically altered species is also a planet named after one of Ayn Rand's books. So it's a clearly philosophy influence right there. This planet was named Fountainhead and declared it was the homeworld of the Nietzschean subrace. Ayn Rand Station was built in orbit around Fountainhead in CY 8402. The station was constructed by converting one of the ships from Museveni's original fleet. Rand Station would later become the political capital of the new Nietzschean alliance. The settlements on Fountainhead continued to grow. The people willingly embraced the philosophy of Dr. Museveni, which was based on elements of Nietzsche, Rand, Darwin, and Dawkins. So you can clearly see, I mean, they're just laying it out there for us. This character, Dr. Museveni, is literally Noonien Sung. It's the same character. It's literally like Gene Roddenberry. I don't know if he kind of articulated these ideas in both of these stories, but you can see that there's clear connections, indisputable connections between these two lines of thinking and the philosophy that he brings with it. So he really, and the Nietzscheans kind of, they're not the main enemy or adversary in the show, but they definitely play an antagonist role to the human Dylan Hunt protagonist group, because they're not the worst and they sometimes ally with them, but they're also really not helpful. So it's both, right? So they're not necessarily the evil ones, but they're clearly bad guys. They're just anti-heroes. Okay. The settlements on Fountainhead continued to grow. The people willingly embraced the philosophy. And it's really interesting that they name Nietzsche, Rand, Darwin, and Dawkins, because they are very modern philosophers. Those are not old school people. So, well, Nietzsche is 1800s, but the rest of them are not old school people. And they're still very used today. Drago Museveni, the son of Dr. Paul Museveni, was born in CY 8403. It is revealed later that Drago had actually time-traveled to the future to obtain DNA from Becca Valentine in order to further enhance the Nietzschean race. Drago's children were the first true Nietzscheans born, the result of genetic modification. Because of his influence, the first pride was formed, Pride Museveni. Drago had a philosophy all future Nietzscheans would come to emulate, most of which was taught by Rade. Due to the modifications of their genetic code, they developed 3 bone spikes called bone blades on each forearm. I think this was just in order to make them look more dangerous and kind of just like make them a little bit distinguished from humans, because you couldn't tell any difference between Khan in the original Star Trek, so I think he updated this idea about the metahumans or whatever, because I think that Khan really wasn't distinguishable from the other one, so it's kind of hard for us to be like, he just looks like a normal human. I don't know, so it's really no distinguishing characteristics, whereas now they clearly have these very strange bone blades things, which they use as weapons randomly, and they can also flex them too, which I saw in the show. 4 years later, nearly 4,000 Nietzschean children were born. These children were the first members of the Homo sapiens invictus, and they were the first generation of Drago Museveni's genetic manipulations. In CY 8422, Paul Museveni died under mysterious circumstances due to a rare type of arsenic poisoning. His son Drago, at age 19, took the mantle of leadership of the Nietzschean people. It was suspected by some that Drago had removed his father but it was never proven. All right. So, blah, blah, blah. You can clearly see that, okay, so this is where we must bring in the Ayn Rand philosophy, because it's clear that it has a huge influence on both the thinking of Gene Roddenberry and his staff, and as well as the story itself. So, objectivism is really about, in a certain sense, in the way that I interpret it at least, I'm sure there's a lot of better experts that can articulate these ideas, but from the way I see it, it's almost like being an island unto yourself in libertarian context, that you have to start on your own, and you have to be your own. You have to be responsible for yourself, and she always says things like the smallest minority is the individual, and she was very concerned with libertarian individual rights, not concerned with collectivism or globalism or any of those things. So she was a very, think for yourself, act for yourself kind of person, and she pushed this forward, but unfortunately, as a person, in her personal life, the way I've seen it from the documentaries and the reading that I've done on it, I feel that she was very selfish, and she decided that in her personal life, she decided to proposition one of the people in her small group to cheat on his wife, and even though both of them were very close to each other. So manipulation and betrayal are components of the history of objectivism, but not necessarily the philosophy of it. So I think he's taking both elements and he's incorporated them into this. So the Nietzscheans are just like Khan, they're stronger, they're not necessarily like extremely smart, unlike the Khan people, they're not like human calculators, they are physically equipped to be stronger and in some ways smarter and faster than other humans. So in this way, I'm going to say that this is where I'm coming to at the end. So in Star Trek, the eugenics people, the augmented humans, are very much in control at the beginning, but they get defeated. They lose, obviously, because the Federation comes out, they make it illegal in DS9. You can see that it's illegal to have augmented humans. I don't know what they do with them, but I'm assuming they charge the parents of the people augmenting their kids. So, which is what they say. And then they institutionalize those people forever, which seems really fucked up. But nevertheless, I think that in the Star Trek universe, Gene Roddenberry used the story of Khan to warn humans about the fact that, listen, humans are being engineered. It's on the way, and I'm telling you the same thing. Humans are being engineered. It's on the way. It's just how we deal with those people and how they deal with us. That's the problem. So, in terms of what they should do about it, I'm going to get to that at the end. But clearly, Star Trek definitely allows you to have a vision of that where the augmented humans are very much not in control anymore. At the end, right? Whereas in the Andromeda universe, they are totally in control because they, even though I think that the Andromeda universe takes place far after the Star Trek universe, it really matters because the Andromeda universe is like the future of Star Trek. So basically, it's longer into the time stream because you can see it's like 8,000 something, right? And Star Trek is only it's like 2,500 or something like that, or 2,200 between those. So in terms of the timeline, it shows a world where the normal humans have been subdued and taken over and betrayed by all of these augmented humans. So augments, they did take over twice, except in this version they were successful. So it's a huge warning to all of us. It's saying, and you can't make it illegal either, because people will do it in other countries. People will do it in secret labs, governments will do it, organizations will do it, and parents will do it too, and you can't stop them. That's one of the points. So it's just a question of how we deal with it and how we have rights for these people and how we have systems in place to allow them to participate in society in a good way and not make them feel like they're outsiders. So I really want to make it clear to people that this idea